There is a quiet paradox hidden inside human history. Today, there are billions of us, speaking, remembering, building, and wondering where we came from. But one genetic study suggests that, long before our species existed, the ancestral line that eventually led to us may have passed through a silence so narrow that only about 1,280 effective breeding individuals carried the story forward. Not a kingdom, not a tribe we can name, just a fragile thread of life. And if that thread had broken, who would have been here to ask where it began? A number can sometimes feel too small to belong inside a human story. 1,280. It is not the number of people in a great city. It is not the number of names carved into an ancient monument. It is smaller than the crowd in a modest theatre, smaller than the population of many quiet villages, smaller than what the modern mind expects when it thinks about the deep roots of humanity. And yet, one genetic study has suggested that, long before our own species appeared, the ancestral line that would eventually lead to us may have passed through a period when only about 1,280 effective breeding individuals carried that line forward. The important word is not only 1,280, the important word is may. This is not a photograph from the past. It is not a census taken by anyone standing on an ancient plain. It is a careful scientific inference drawn from patterns inside the genetic diversity of people living today. That makes the idea powerful, but also delicate. It asks us to imagine a past we cannot see directly, and to do so without turning uncertainty into a false certainty. If we slow down and look at the number calmly, it becomes even stranger. Today, human beings fill cities, villages, islands, mountains, deserts, and coastlines. Our languages divide into thousands of branches. Our memories are stored in books, songs, names, graves, tools, and stories. We often speak of humanity as if it was something vast and inevitable, as if the appearance of people like us was always waiting at the end of time. But deep history does not promise anything. It does not move with a plan. It does not protect one lineage, because that lineage will one day learn to speak, count, build, or wonder. In the ancient world, the ancestors behind this number would not have known they were important. They would not have known that their survival might matter to a future they could not imagine. They were not guarding humanity in the way we use that word now. They were simply living, moving, eating, choosing, mating, losing children, finding shelter, remembering paths, and trying to last through another season. This is why the number 1,280 should not be treated like a dramatic movie scene with the last humans standing under a dark sky. It is quieter than that. It points to a narrowing, a bottleneck, a place in time where the genetic road may have become extremely thin. There may have been other ancient human groups alive in the wider world. There may have been scattered populations whose stories did not continue into us in the same way. The number does not mean that someone counted every ancient person on Earth and found only 1,280 bodies breathing. It means that, according to this model, the effective breeding population behind one ancestral line may have become that small. And that difference matters because a truthful story must be careful with its strongest image. Still, even when we explain it carefully, the image remains haunting. A lineage that becomes very small also becomes fragile. Each birth matters more. Each death removes more than one life. It may remove a rare genetic possibility. Each small group carries memory not in writing, but in bodies, habits, roots, and relationships. Nothing about that world would have looked like modern history. There were no records, no maps, no nations, no written warnings saying that the future was at risk. There were only living beings in changing environments, under skies that did not know their names. To begin this story, then, we should not ask whether 1,280 is a perfect final answer. We should ask why such a number can be suggested at all. What must have happened in the deep past for the genetic traces of living people today to carry the shape of a narrowing so old, so quiet, and so close to being forgotten? To understand the number 1,280, we have to move slowly, because the number can easily mislead the imagination. When we hear that our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, the mind may picture a final camp of ancient people, gathered in one place, surrounded by danger, waiting to see whether the human story would continue. But that is not what the scientific idea is saying. The number does not mean that every ancient human-like being on Earth had been counted and reduced to one small crowd. It does not mean that the entire world held only 1,280 living bodies. Instead, the number refers to something more technical, quieter, and in some ways even more mysterious: an effective breeding population. A total population is the number of individuals who may be alive. An effective breeding population is smaller and more specific. It refers to the individuals whose genes are actually passed forward in a lasting way through reproduction. In any species, many individuals may live, but not all leave descendants. Some die young. Some never have children. Some have children whose lines end after a few generations. Some groups may survive for a time, then disappear without contributing much to the long genetic thread that reaches the present. So when we speak of 1,280 effective breeding individuals, we are not imagining a simple head count. We are speaking about the narrow part of the ancestral stream that may have continued flowing toward us. This matters deeply for a truthful story, because the difference between these two ideas is the difference between science and exaggeration. If we say there were only 1,280 humans left, we may create an image too sharp, too confident, and too dramatic. But if we say, one study suggests that the effective breeding population behind our ancestral line may have fallen to about 1,280, the sentence becomes more careful. It leaves room for uncertainty. It respects the limits of what genetic models can tell us. It also keeps the wonder intact, because even this careful version remains extraordinary. Imagine a wide river that once had many channels. Some channels dry out. Some sink into the ground. Some run into closed basins and leave no path forward. The stream that eventually reaches the sea may pass through a place where it becomes very narrow. That narrow place is not the whole river's past, but it shapes everything downstream. In the same way, a bottleneck in ancestry does not need to mean that no other ancient groups existed. It means that the line whose genetic traces are still visible in us may have passed through a long, restricted passage. And if that passage lasted many generations, then chance itself would have become powerful. A small group does not carry all the variation that a larger group carries. Certain traits, certain gene variants, certain possibilities may vanish simply because the people carrying them do not leave descendants. Others may become more common, not because they were perfect, but because they happened to survive inside the few lines that continued. This is one reason the number 1,280 feels so different from ordinary history. We are not talking about a king, a battle, a migration, or a single invention. We are talking about ancestry at its most basic level: who had children, whose children lived, whose descendants remained connected to the long road leading to us. The people behind such a number would not have seen themselves as members of a tiny future-making population. They would have known hunger, weather, distance, fear, fatigue, and perhaps the comfort of familiar faces. They would have known which plants appeared after rain, where animals crossed, where stone could be found, where water might remain in a dry season. Their lives were immediate. Yet somewhere beneath those ordinary struggles, the deeper mathematics of survival was being written, not in symbols, not in language, not in memory as we understand it. It was written in inheritance. This is why the title must remain cautious. Our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, but that phrase is not a simple picture of the past. It is a window into how fragile a lineage can become before anyone exists to call it human. If no one stood beside our ancestors with a counting tool, and if no one wrote down the size of their groups, then how can anyone suggest a number like 1,280 from a world nearly 1 million years old. This is where the story becomes quieter and also more difficult. The past does not always survive as bones in the ground. Sometimes it survives as absence. Sometimes it survives as a pattern of what is missing, narrowed, or repeated in the living body. Geneticists do not look into modern DNA and see a clear, moving picture of ancient people walking across a plain. They see variation. They see differences and similarities between people alive today. They compare patterns across many genomes and ask what kind of population history might have produced them. A large, stable, ancestral population tends to preserve more genetic diversity. A smaller population, especially one that remains small for many generations, tends to lose diversity. Lines disappear. Rare variants vanish. The genetic stream becomes thinner. When later generations expand again, they may become numerous, but they do not automatically recover everything that was lost during the narrow passage. This is why a bottleneck can leave a shadow long after the people who lived through it are gone. The study behind the 1,280 figure used a model to infer that the ancestral line leading toward modern humans may have passed through an unusually severe reduction, roughly 930,000 to 813,000 years ago. That does not mean the model is a perfect window. It means the researchers found a possible explanation for patterns in present-day genetic diversity. The number is not a fossil. It is not a campsite. It is not a group photograph. It is a mathematical reconstruction built from living data and shaped by assumptions that other scientists can test, question, refine, or challenge. This is important because the origin story of humanity is not one clean road with signposts along the way. It is a landscape of partial evidence. Bones may be found in one region and missing from another. Stone tools may survive where bodies do not. Climate records may show pressure, but not tell us exactly which families endured it. DNA can preserve traces of ancestry, but it cannot give us the names, faces, voices, fears, or daily choices of those who carried that ancestry forward. When we say our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, we are standing at the edge of all these limits. We are not looking at certainty, we are looking at a carefully drawn possibility. Yet even a possibility can change the way we feel about our beginning. It reminds us that the story of human origin was not guaranteed by intelligence, strength, or destiny. Before Homo sapiens existed, before language became rich enough to hold stories like this, before any person could ask where they came from, the ancestral line may have depended on a surprisingly small number of successful connections between bodies, births, and surviving children. Each generation would have been ordinary to itself. A mother carrying an infant would not know she was part of a bottleneck. A young adult finding food near a dry riverbed would not know that future scientists might one day search for the faint signature of that world inside modern genomes. A group crossing a cold open landscape would not know that the continuation of their line could matter hundreds of thousands of years later. They simply lived inside the present, available to them. This is what makes the number feel so strange. It is both intimate and distant. It belongs to bodies, but we reach it through equations. It points to lives, but it cannot tell us their stories. It suggests a fragile origin, but it does not allow us to pretend that we know more than we do. So the first doorway of this video is not only the question of whether 1,280 is exactly right. It is the deeper question of how much of our beginning is hidden inside evidence that can only speak in fragments, shadows, and probabilities. To enter the world behind the number 1,280, we have to leave behind almost everything that feels familiar about human history. There were no cities, no fields of grain, no written language, no villages with names, and no memory kept in stone walls or books. The world was deep inside the Pleistocene, a long age of shifting cold and warmth, when climate did not stay still for very long. Ice expanded and retreated, rainfall patterns changed, forests opened, grasslands spread, rivers moved through changing valleys, and coastlines were not always where coastlines are today. This was not a frozen world everywhere, and it was not a single endless winter. It was more complicated than that. Some places would have been cold and dry. Some would have held woodlands, lakes, wetlands, open plains, or patches of sheltering trees. What mattered for ancient life was not only temperature, but change. A place that could support animals, plants, and human ancestors for many generations might slowly become harder to live in. A familiar route might become dry. A valley that once held water might no longer be reliable. A group that depended on a certain landscape could be pushed to move, split, or search in smaller circles for what remained. In this kind of world, survival was not a dramatic event. It was a quiet negotiation with the land, repeated day after day. The ancestors connected to the 1,280 estimate did not live in the age of modern humans. Homo sapiens had not yet appeared. The beings who carried the distant line toward us belonged to earlier human relatives, part of a wider and more complex human family that is still difficult to describe with complete certainty. They were not apes in the old forest sense, but they were not people like us either. Their bodies were already shaped for walking on the ground. Their hands could use and make stone tools. Their minds could remember places, recognize danger, learn from repeated seasons, and depend on others in ways that were probably essential. But we should not dress them too quickly in modern imagination. We should not place them in neat camps with clear social roles, polished speech, or secure fires glowing like scenes from a much later human story. Nearly 1 million years ago, life was older, rougher, and less documented than that. If the ancestral line truly narrowed during this period, it may have done so inside a world that kept changing faster than small groups could comfortably absorb. Climate pressure does not need to destroy a population all at once. It can work slowly. It can reduce the places where food is predictable. It can make births riskier, travel longer, childhood more fragile, and separation more common. A small group may survive one dry season, then lose too many members in another. Another group may endure in a better valley, but remain isolated. Over many generations, such pressures can shape ancestry without leaving behind a simple story. This is why the number 1,280 belongs so strongly to the environment around it. It is not just a number floating in genetic theory. It asks us to imagine bodies living within a restless earth, where the future depended on whether enough children survived, whether enough adults found one another, and whether enough groups remained connected to keep the ancestral thread from thinning beyond repair. The sky above them would not have looked like a warning. The wind would not have announced that a bottleneck was happening. There would only have been ordinary signs: less water in a known place, fewer animals passing through, colder nights, longer walks, a child too weak to continue, a remembered path that no longer led to food. Deep history often hides inside these ordinary pressures. It does not need a single catastrophe to become dangerous. Sometimes the road narrows because the world changes slowly, and the living must keep adjusting until only a thin line continues forward. The beings who lived near the time suggested by the 1,280 estimate were not modern humans standing at the edge of civilization. They were not Homo sapiens, and they did not yet carry the full shape of the human world we know. To imagine them clearly, we have to place them between two wrong pictures. They were not apes, still living only in trees, untouched by the long transformation of the body, but they were also not people like us, sitting around settled fires with language, ritual, clothing, and memory in the modern sense. They belonged to the older human family, a world of early Homo populations whose names and relationships are still partly uncertain. Some may have been close to Homo erectus or descended from populations like it. Others may have belonged to later branches that would eventually connect, in complicated ways, to the ancestors of modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The important point is that this was not a single, simple species marching forward in a straight line. Human evolution was already branching, spreading, thinning, and changing. Around this ancient time, there were human relatives in Africa and Eurasia, shaped by different landscapes and different pressures. Some groups may have lived near rivers, lakes, woodland edges, or open grasslands. Some may have moved across long distances, following food, stone, water, and memory. Their bodies were more human-like than the bodies of earlier ape-like ancestors. They walked upright on long legs. Their hands were free to carry, break, shape, and hold. Their skulls were not shaped like ours. The face could be stronger, the brow more pronounced, the forehead lower, the jaw heavier. Their brains were larger than those of earlier hominins, but still not the same as the modern human brain in size, organization, or cultural world. If we saw them from a distance, we might recognize something deeply familiar in the way they stood, walked, watched, and gathered with others. But if we came closer, the difference would become just as clear. They were kin, not copies. This is where the title becomes important again. When our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, we are not speaking about a modern human population losing its cities or tools. We are speaking about an older, ancestral line, before our species had appeared, moving through a harsh and uncertain world with only the abilities available to early humans of that time. Their survival depended less on imagination in the modern sense, and more on repeated knowledge held in the body and the group. Where could sharp stone be found? Which direction led to water after dry months? Which animals were dangerous from a distance, and which remains could be scavenged safely? Which plants returned after rain? Which places gave shade, shelter, or a view across open land? Their world was practical before it was symbolic. It was felt through feet, hands, hunger, weather, injury, and the presence or absence of other bodies nearby. We should be careful not to make them too simple. Early humans were not empty creatures waiting for intelligence to arrive. They could learn, they could remember, they could cooperate at some level. They could make and use stone tools, and those tools show that thought was already moving through material. A stone edge is not just a broken rock when it is chosen, shaped, and used again. It is a quiet sign that an ancient mind understood force, angle, need, and result. Yet we should also be careful not to give them everything that belongs to later human life. We do not need to imagine full speech, myths, clothing, homes, or complex ceremonies in order to respect them. Their lives were already meaningful because they were lived under pressure, in small groups, across changing landscapes, with no guarantee that their line would continue. The possible bottleneck matters because it may have happened among beings like these, not animals without memory, not humans with history, but early relatives carrying the fragile middle ground between the two. They were close enough to us to be part of our beginning, and distant enough that their inner world remains mostly unreachable. In that distance, the number 1,280 becomes quieter. It no longer looks like a crowd we can count. It becomes a thin ancestral passage, carried by upright bodies, rough tools, remembered places, and generations that did not know they were holding open the road to us. This story is not about civilization. It is not about the first city, the first field, the first written word, or the first person who looked at a river and gave it a name. Those things belong to a much later human world. The world behind the 1,280 estimate was older and quieter, a world where the future of our line may have depended on lives that left almost no visible trace. To understand that, we have to let go of the idea that human importance begins only when humans start building things we can recognize. Long before houses, graves, songs, laws, or stories, there were bodies moving through landscapes, and those bodies mattered because they carried inheritance. They carried the unfinished possibility of us without knowing it. The ancestors in this part of deep time did not have a word for humanity. They did not know they belonged to a lineage. They could not look forward across hundreds of thousands of years and imagine children who would one day speak in thousands of languages, cross oceans, study DNA, or ask whether the whole story had once nearly disappeared. Their lives were not organized around a grand future. Their lives were organized around nearness, nearby water, nearby danger, nearby companions, nearby food, nearby weather. This is why the possible bottleneck is so powerful. It places the origin of our later abundance inside a time when abundance was not guaranteed. If the ancestral line became very small, then the future was not protected by intelligence alone. It depended on the survival of enough infants, the strength of enough mothers, the decisions of enough adults, the memory of enough paths, and the chance that separated groups did not become too isolated for too long. There is a kind of humility in this. We often imagine human history as a rising path, from simple to complex, from darkness to knowledge, from weakness to power. But evolution is not a ladder, and survival is not a reward given to the most deserving. A lineage can continue because it is suited enough for a moment. It can disappear because the environment changes in ways no body can fully answer. It can narrow not because its members failed, but because the world around them became difficult, scattered, dry, cold, unstable, or simply unlucky. In the age before Homo sapiens, before the modern human face and mind fully appeared, the ancestral line may have been one fragile thread among many other threads. Some related groups may have lived, moved, adapted, and vanished. Some may have contributed to later populations in ways still difficult to reconstruct. Others may have left tools without bones, bones without DNA, or no trace at all. Deep time is not a complete archive. It is full of empty rooms. The idea of 1,280 belongs inside those empty rooms, not as a final answer, but as a signal. It tells us that the road to modern humanity may have once been narrower than our modern confidence wants to believe. And because this happened before our species existed, we should not imagine a small band of Homo sapiens clinging to survival. The line was older than that. It moved through earlier human relatives, through bodies that were familiar enough to be kin and different enough to remain mysterious. They may have known each other by presence, sound, gesture, habit, and repeated closeness. They may have learned from one another without needing the kind of language we use now. They may have cared for young, noticed injury, followed seasonal movement, and returned to places where stone, shade, or water could be found. But we must not decorate their world too much. A truthful story does not need to give them modern speech, modern clothing, or modern thought in order to make them matter. Their value is not in how much they resembled us. Their value is that, through them, the line continued, that is enough. In a sleep story about origin, this is the quiet center. Before humanity became visible to itself, before it could remember its own beginning, something vulnerable had to keep living. The possible reduction to 1,280 is not only a number in a scientific paper. It is a reminder that our beginning may have passed through a stage so narrow that history, if it could breathe, might have held its breath. To nearly disappear in evolution does not always look like disappearance from the outside. This is one of the hardest ideas to hold gently. A group may still be alive somewhere on the landscape. Fires, if they were used in that place and time, may still appear. Feet may still press into mud. Stone flakes may still fall beside a riverbank. Children may still be born, carried, fed, and watched. Yet the deeper line that reaches the far future may already be narrowing. Survival in the moment and survival in ancestry are not exactly the same thing. A population can exist for a while and still leave little or nothing behind in the genetic story that later generations inherit. This is why the idea that our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280 must be understood as a question about lineage, not just about bodies standing in one place. It does not require us to imagine the last ancient humans gathered under one sky. It asks us to imagine something quieter, many possible lives, many possible branches, but only a very small portion of them continuing into the long road that eventually led to us. In ordinary thinking, extinction seems simple. A creature is there, and then it is gone. But in deep human history, the boundary can be much softer. Some groups may survive for thousands of years, then fade. Some may mix with others. Some may leave tools, but no living descendants. Some may contribute a little to later populations, while others become evolutionary side paths. The world before Homo sapiens was not a clean family tree with one trunk rising neatly upward. It was more like a dry landscape after rain, with channels forming, dividing, reconnecting, and disappearing into the ground. The stream that reaches the present is only one part of the whole movement. When scientists speak about a bottleneck, they are not necessarily saying that every related group vanished at once. They are saying that the continuing ancestral stream may have passed through a narrow point where fewer breeding individuals contributed to the future. That narrow point matters because the future can only inherit from those who actually leave descendants. If an ancient group lived, struggled, and died out without descendants that reached later humans, then its experience was real, but its genetic path ended. This is a cold truth, and it should be spoken without cruelty. Evolution does not remember every life equally. It does not preserve every effort, every fear, every migration, or every small act of care. It preserves what happens to pass through reproduction, survival, and time. A mother may protect a child, but if that child's line ends generations later, the genetic trace may vanish. A skilled adult may know a landscape well, but if no descendants continue from that line, the skill disappears with bodies and memory. A small group may endure hardship for a long period, only to be removed from the future by drought, isolation, disease, conflict, hunger, or chance. None of this means those lives were unimportant. It means that ancestry is selective in a way that feels almost unfair to the human mind. The 1,280 estimate sits inside this uncomfortable space. It suggests that the line leading toward modern humans may once have been carried forward by a very small effective breeding population. Around that line, there may have been other ancient humans or human relatives whose stories are harder to connect to us. Some may have been close kin, some may have been distant cousins, some may have crossed paths, shared landscapes, or never met at all. But if their descendants did not remain part of the thread that reaches living people today, then they become almost invisible from the genetic viewpoint. That invisibility is not the same as never existing. It is one of the reasons deep prehistory must be told with humility. We are not looking at the whole world. We are looking at fragments that survived, a bone here, a tool there, a climate signal in old sediments, a pattern in modern genomes. To say that humanity nearly disappeared is therefore not to claim that the ancient Earth suddenly emptied. It is to say that the path leading to us may have become dangerously thin. The danger may not have looked like a single final night. It may have looked like generations of smaller groups, fewer successful births, greater separation, and less genetic variation passing forward. The world would have continued, animals would have moved, rivers would have flowed, seasons would have returned. But somewhere within that continuing world, the ancestral road may have narrowed until the future depended on a small number of living connections. The number of living bodies is not always the same as the number that shapes the future. This is why the idea of an effective breeding population matters so much in the story of the 1,280. In a simple picture, we may imagine a landscape with many ancient humans or human relatives moving through it, and we may think that every one of them carried the future equally. But ancestry does not work that way. A life can be real, full, difficult, and meaningful, yet still leave no lasting genetic path into later generations. Some individuals may never have children. Some may have children who do not survive to adulthood. Some may belong to small groups that become isolated, weaken over generations, or disappear when a local environment changes. Others may have descendants for a while, only for that branch to end much later. The future is not shaped by everyone who lives. It is shaped by the smaller number whose descendants continue. That smaller number is what makes the phrase effective breeding populations so important. It is not a cold replacement for actual life. It is a way of describing how much of a population truly contributes to the next chapters of inheritance. If a large group has only a few individuals whose descendants continue, the genetic future can look much smaller than the visible population. If many people are alive but closely related, isolated, or unevenly represented in reproduction, the effective size can shrink. This is not unique to humans. It is a general idea in population genetics. But when we apply it to our own deep origin, it becomes emotionally difficult. It asks us to accept that the road to us may have depended not on how many ancient relatives existed somewhere, but on how many remained connected to the particular ancestral stream that did not break. This is where the number 1,280 becomes less like a head count and more like a measure of fragility. A population could be larger in the ordinary sense and still have a narrow genetic future. Imagine many small groups scattered across changing land. Some are too far apart to exchange partners, often. Some suffer repeated losses. Some are reduced by drought, cold, food shortage, disease, or chance. Some may survive locally for a long time, but contribute little to the line that eventually leads onward. From the viewpoint of the living world at that time, there may have been movement, noise, births, deaths, and many separate struggles. From the viewpoint of later DNA, only a thin part of that living world may remain visible. This is why a truthful telling of the 1,280 must avoid the easiest, dramatic mistake. We should not say that only 1,280 human beings stood on Earth unless the evidence truly said that. The stronger and safer statement is that one model suggests the effective breeding population in the ancestral line may have fallen to about that number. The difference may sound small, but it protects the honesty of the whole story. It also makes the story deeper because it shows how survival can be hidden beneath ordinary life. A group does not need to know it is genetically important. A child does not need to know that their descendants will matter. A pair of adults does not need to know that their line will continue while another line fades. They simply live inside the needs of the day. They search for food, avoid danger, stay near companions, cross difficult ground, and carry young through weather that offers no promise. Yet over many generations, these ordinary acts become the structure of ancestry. The title of this video points toward that quiet structure. When our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, the shrinkage was not necessarily something anyone could see with their eyes. It may have been a hidden narrowing inside reproduction, descent, and time. The visible world may have remained wide, but the inherited road may have become thin. And once we understand that, the question changes. We are no longer asking only how many ancient people were alive. We are asking how many of them remained part of the line that would one day become capable of asking the question. The deepest parts of human history are not empty because nothing happened there. They are empty because so little survived for us to find. A life can pass across the earth, leave footprints in wet soil, carry a child, break stone, sleep beside others, look toward rain, and vanish without leaving a bone that lasts. A group can live for many generations and still leave behind almost nothing that a future scientist can hold. This silence is one reason the possible bottleneck behind the 1,280 feels so difficult to understand. We want the past to answer us clearly. We want a layer of earth to open and show where our ancestors were, how many they were, what they looked like, and why their line became so narrow. But the earth does not preserve memory evenly. Some places protect bones, others destroy them. Acidic soil can erase what once lived. Water can scatter remains. Heat, pressure, animals, erosion, and time can break the body into pieces too small to recognize. Stone tools often survive better than bone, but a tool can tell us only part of the story. It can show that a hand struck stone, that a sharp edge was made, that a task may have been done nearby. It cannot tell us how many people were present, how many children survived, how isolated the group was, or whether their descendants continued toward us. This is why the fossil record can feel both precious and painfully incomplete. A single jaw, a tooth, a skull fragment, or a shaped stone can open a window into a vanished world, but a window is not the whole landscape. Around every discovery there are missing seasons, missing bodies, missing movements, missing failures, and missing lines of descent. When we speak about our ancestors possibly shrinking to 1,280 effective breeding individuals, we are speaking across this silence. The genetic signal may suggest a narrowing, But the ground does not always provide a simple matching picture. There may not be a neat row of fossils showing a population becoming smaller year after year. Deep time rarely gives that kind of evidence. Instead, it gives fragments from different places, different species, different climates, and different moments. Scientists must compare them carefully, knowing that absence is not proof that nothing was there. A region with few fossils may once have held many lives. A period with little evidence may have been full of movement, hunger, birth, care, and loss. The silence itself should make us humble. It should stop us from turning the 1,280 into a clean scene, as if we could watch the last members of a lineage gathered in one valley. We cannot. We can only say that one genetic model points toward a severe narrowing in the ancestral line, while the fossil and archaeological record remains too fragmentary to fill in every face, place, and cause. That may feel unsatisfying, but it is also where the truth becomes more meaningful. The story of origin is not made only from what we know, it is also shaped by what we cannot recover. The people, or early human relatives, behind this possible bottleneck may have crossed landscapes that no longer look the same. Their camps, if they had resting places, may have disappeared under sediment, been washed away, or left no clear mark at all. Their children may have grown, reproduced, and carried the line forward without leaving a single preserved bone. Others may have lived just as fully and then vanished from inheritance. The earth kept some evidence and released it slowly. It kept much more hidden forever. So when we listen to the number 1,280, we should hear not only danger, but distance. We should hear the long silence between lived experience and surviving evidence. We should hear how much of our beginning may have depended on people whose names, faces, and exact homes are gone, while only the faint outline of their survival remains. Climate does not need to arrive as a disaster in order to change the shape of ancestry. It can work more slowly than fear. It can move through rain, temperature, vegetation, river levels, animal movement, and the long patience of seasons that no longer behave as they once did. Around the broad period connected to the possible bottleneck, Earth was living through major Pleistocene climate instability. Glacial and interglacial rhythms were changing, and the world's environments did not offer one steady background for ancient life. For early human relatives, this kind of change would not have been understood as climate in the modern sense. They would not have measured ice, charted rainfall, or known that distant changes in Earth's systems could alter the ground beneath their feet. They would have known it in smaller signs. A water source that had been reliable might last for fewer months. A patch of woodland might open into drier ground. Animals might pass less often through a known place. Fruits, roots, seeds, or edible plants might appear differently from one season to the next. A sheltering landscape might become more exposed. None of these changes alone has to destroy a population, but together, across many generations, they can make life narrower. This is the kind of pressure that belongs beside the number 1,280. Not a single storm, not one night when everything ended, a slow reduction in possibility. If food becomes harder to predict, groups may need to move farther. If water becomes less dependable, families may gather in fewer places, or separate into smaller groups searching for survival. If forests shrink in one area and open ground spreads in another, animals change their routes, and early humans must follow, adapt, or remain behind. A population can be weakened not only by death, but by distance. When groups become scattered, they may meet less often. When they meet less often, the exchange of partners may become less regular. When reproduction becomes concentrated in fewer, connected lines, the effective breeding population can fall even if living beings still remain across a wider landscape. This is why climate matters to the title, but only carefully. We cannot say with certainty that one climate event caused our ancestors to shrink to 1,280. The evidence does not allow such a clean sentence. What we can say is that environmental pressure is a reasonable part of the discussion, because a lineage does not narrow in empty space. It narrows inside a world of food, water, movement, birth, death, and separation. For the beings who carried the ancestral thread, The changing Earth may have been felt as longer walks, thinner resources, fewer safe places, and more fragile childhoods. A young life needs more than birth. It needs time. It needs protection, feeding, carrying, learning, and enough stability for the body to reach adulthood. If conditions make childhood harder, the future becomes harder too. And if fewer children survive to have children of their own, the genetic road begins to tighten. The ancient landscape would still have looked alive. Grass would move in the wind. Herd animals would pass through open country. Predators would watch from cover. Rivers would still reflect the sky. But under that living surface, the ancestral line may have been losing width. This is the quiet danger of climate pressure. It does not always announce itself as extinction. It may appear as a valley abandoned after generations of use, a dry place where water had once gathered, a group too small to recover after repeated losses, or a familiar route that no longer leads to enough food. To modern eyes, the number 1,280 feels sudden, almost impossible. To deep time, it may have been the result of countless small pressures building slowly, until the road forward belonged to fewer and fewer successful lives. When a world becomes harder to predict, small groups do not always disappear at once. More often, they become separated. A group that once moved through a familiar region may begin to find that the old paths no longer work as well. A river may still exist, but the water may not last through the same part of the year. A woodland may still offer shade, but fewer edible plants may return there. Herd animals may still cross the land, but not as regularly, and not always in the places remembered by older members of the group. For early human relatives, this kind of uncertainty would have changed the meaning of distance. A few miles farther to water could matter. A few days without finding enough food could weaken children, elders, and injured adults. A season of poor births could leave a group smaller than before, and when groups became smaller, they would have had fewer chances to recover from loss. This is one way the road toward the number 1,280 may have narrowed, not through one visible collapse, but through repeated separations across landscapes that no longer held groups together easily. In a more stable environment, neighboring groups might cross paths often enough for exchange, mating, learning, and movement between them. But in a more fragmented world, groups could become like small islands on land. One group might remain near a lake, another might follow animals into open country, another might stay close to stone sources or seasonal plants. Over time, the spaces between them could become more than geography. They could become genetic distance. If groups met less often, fewer individuals would contribute to the wider ancestral line. If some groups became too small, too isolated, or too vulnerable, their lines could fade even while life continued elsewhere. This is why a bottleneck is not only about numbers, it is also about connection. A scattered population can be alive, but weakly connected, and a weakly connected population may carry less genetic variety into the future than its visible size suggests. The ancestors behind this possible narrowing would not have understood any of this as population structure. They would not have known that isolation could shape descendants hundreds of thousands of years later. They would only have known the felt reality of the land. They would know that a place once good for resting no longer felt safe. They would know that certain animals no longer came through at the same time. They would know that moving too far could be dangerous, but staying too long could be dangerous too. The young would learn roots from the old, but some roots may have slowly lost their value. Memory, which had once helped survival, could become less reliable when the world changed. This is a quiet kind of pressure. It does not destroy knowledge all at once. It makes knowledge harder to use. It turns familiar land into a question. For a small group, every decision would carry weight, move toward open ground, and risk exposure. Stay near trees and risk hunger if food declines. Follow animals and risk losing contact with others. Remain close to a known water source and risk being trapped if it dries. These are not dramatic choices in the way modern stories describe drama. They are slow choices, repeated again and again, until some groups grow weaker, some move away, and some no longer remain part of the continuing line. The phrase, "our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, becomes more understandable when seen through this kind of separation. It may not mean that the world suddenly became empty. It may mean that the connected ancestral network became thin. Fewer groups were linked. Fewer individuals successfully reproduced into the long future. Fewer branches remained alive in the genetic stream that would eventually lead to us. The Earth itself would not have looked empty. There would still be wind, animals, trees, stones, insects, birds, water, and sky. But the human road inside that world may have become fragile because the groups carrying it were small, scattered, and living inside uncertainty. In deep time, isolation can be as dangerous as hunger. A group alone may survive today, but if it remains cut off for too long, its future becomes narrower. And if enough groups become small enough, far enough apart, and fragile enough at the same time, ancestry itself begins to pass through a gate that only a few can carry. A careful origin story must know where to stop. It is tempting to take the possible bottleneck of 1,280 and search for one clear cause, one event, one hard answer that explains why the ancestral road became so narrow: a great drought, a long cold period, a vanished forest, a broken migration route, a collapse in food. Any one of these can sound convincing when placed beside a small number, but deep time rarely gives us a single door with a label on it. The ancestors behind this possible narrowing lived in a world shaped by climate, geography, food, distance, birth, death, and chance, all working together in ways we cannot fully separate. This is why we should speak of climate and environmental pressure as possibilities, not as a completed verdict. The number 1,280 comes from a genetic model. It suggests that the effective breeding population in the ancestral line leading toward us may have become extremely small for a long period. But the model does not show us one valley, one season, one disaster, or one exact group of frightened individuals. It gives a signal of narrowing. To understand what may have stood around that signal, scientists look toward climate records, fossils, archaeological traces, and the broader pattern of early human evolution. These different forms of evidence can point in useful directions, but they do not always line up into one simple story. A climate record may suggest stress, a gap in fossils may suggest absence, or it may simply mean the evidence has not survived. Stone tools may show that early humans were present somewhere, but not how many were reproducing successfully across the larger ancestral network. DNA may show a loss of diversity, but not the face of the child who did not survive, or the group that became isolated beyond recovery. This uncertainty does not weaken the story, it makes the story more honest. If we say, climate caused the bottleneck, we may sound stronger, but we may also be less truthful. If we say, climate change, environmental instability, population separation, and other pressures may have contributed to a severe narrowing, we leave space for what is known and what is still unknown. That space matters, especially when the subject is human origin. People want origin stories to be certain. They want to know when the danger began, where the survivors stood, and why the line continued. But the deeper we go, the more the past answers in fragments. It gives us probability instead of memory. It gives us patterns instead of voices. It gives us a number that may be meaningful, but not a complete scene. The ancestors themselves would not have known any cause. They would not have said that climate was changing or that a bottleneck was shaping their descendants. They would have known hunger when food was scarce, distance when water was far, fear when a child weakened, and relief when a familiar place still offered shelter. Their world was lived in immediate signs, not scientific explanations. A dry riverbed did not need to be understood globally to be dangerous. A season with fewer animals did not need to be named to change the future. A group separated from others did not need to understand gene flow to become more vulnerable. The truth may be that no single pressure carried the whole story. Instead, many small pressures may have gathered slowly, colder or drier periods, shifting habitats, fewer reliable resources, greater separation between groups, and the ordinary randomness that affects every small population. Some groups may have endured, some may have faded, some may have crossed paths again. Some may have left no descendants that reached us. Inside that long uncertainty, the ancestral line may have passed through a narrow gate. So this part of the story should remain open, not empty, but open. The 1280 should not be used as a final answer to everything. It should be treated as a sign that the road behind us may have once become extremely thin, and that the reasons for that thinning may belong not to one dramatic moment, but to a slow meeting of Earth, climate, distance, biology, and chance. To imagine life in a small ancestral world, we should begin with ordinary needs rather than dramatic scenes. The beings connected to the possible bottleneck did not wake each day thinking about survival as an idea. They lived inside survival as a rhythm of the body. Hunger, thirst, warmth, distance, injury, and the presence of others shaped what could be done. A day might begin near a place that had been safe enough through the night, but safety was never complete. The land held food, but not always in the same place. Water could be present, but not always close. Animals could provide opportunity, but also danger. Plants, roots, fruits, seeds, insects, eggs, and scavenged remains may all have mattered at different times and in different landscapes, depending on what was available. We should not imagine a single diet or a single way of life for all early human relatives across such a wide period. Some groups may have lived near rivers or lakes. Some may have moved through woodland edges. Some may have crossed more open ground. What they shared was not a modern plan, but the need to keep finding enough energy for the group to continue. In a large and stable population, one bad season may hurt, but the wider network can still remain strong. In a small and scattered ancestral world, the same bad season can mean something heavier. It can reduce births, weaken children, separate groups, or remove individuals whose descendants would otherwise have carried part of the future. This is where the title returns quietly. If our ancestors may have shrunk to about 1,280 effective breeding individuals, then daily life was not just background. Daily life was the place where the bottleneck was either tightened or survived. A stone tool used to cut, scrape, or break was not only a tool, it was a small answer to hunger. A remembered water source was not only a location, it was a possible bridge between one generation and the next. A path across open land was not only movement, it was a risk that could bring food, contact, danger, or loss. Early humans of this older world likely depended on movement, but movement itself was costly. Carrying young, protecting injured members, crossing exposed ground, and searching for resources all demanded energy. Staying in one place too long could become dangerous if resources declined. Moving too far could become dangerous if the group lost contact with familiar places or other groups. Their lives may have followed seasonal patterns, but those patterns were not calendars. They were learned through repetition, when certain plants appeared, when animals passed, when water remained, when heat or cold made a place harder to endure. Older individuals may have held valuable knowledge simply by remembering what had happened before. A young member of the group did not need a written map if the group carried memory through bodies and habits, but in an unstable climate, even memory could be tested. A place that had fed the group before might not feed them again. A path that had led to water might lead to dust. A group that once met others at a familiar crossing might arrive and find no one. In that kind of world, the future depended on small successes repeated many times. Enough food found, enough children kept alive, enough adults reaching one another, enough genetic connection remaining between scattered groups. None of this requires us to invent scenes we cannot prove. We do not need to say exactly what they ate on a certain day, what words they used, or whether they sat around controlled fires in the way later humans did. A truthful picture can remain simple. Early human relatives moving through changing landscapes, using stone tools, reading signs in the land, staying near others when they could, and adjusting to a world that did not promise stability. Their lives were not primitive in the sense of being empty. They were full of attention. Attention to tracks, weather, distance, sound, smell, injury, hunger, and the behavior of companions. If the ancestral line narrowed during this time, then attention itself may have been one of the quiet forces that kept it from breaking, not destiny, not greatness, just enough awareness, enough cooperation, enough movement, and enough luck for a thin line of life to continue. A small ancestral world would have required more than strength. It would have required memory, not memory in the modern sense of stories written down, or names kept across generations, or maps drawn on a surface. It would have been a living memory, held in feet, hands, eyes, habits, and repeated movement across the land. For early human relatives living near the time of the possible bottleneck, the difference between survival and loss may often have depended on remembering where things could be found. A place where stone broke well, a slope where animals sometimes passed, a hollow where water remained after dry months, a stand of trees that gave shade, a safer route around exposed ground. These details may seem small when compared with the great number in the title, 1,280, but a bottleneck is made from small details becoming important over and over again. A population does not continue because of one heroic act. It continues because enough ordinary needs are met enough times for children to grow, adults to remain connected, and the next generation to begin. Stone tools were part of that quiet survival. They were not modern tools, and we should not imagine them as polished objects with names and owners in the way later people might have understood them, but they were still powerful signs of thought. A sharp flake could cut through hide, meat, plant material, or other useful resources. A heavier stone could break bone or crack something hard. A shaped edge could make a task easier, faster, or less dangerous. In a world where food might be scattered and uncertain, even a simple improvement mattered. A tool did not guarantee survival, but it changed what a hand could do. It allowed the body to reach into opportunities that teeth and nails alone could not manage. And when the ancestral line may have been extremely small, every such advantage would have belonged directly to the question of continuation. The mind behind a stone tool did not need to be modern to be meaningful. Choosing the right stone already required attention. Striking it at the right angle required practice. Carrying it, returning to it, or making another when needed required a relationship with material and place. This kind of knowledge may have passed through watching, repetition, and shared activity rather than formal teaching. A younger individual could learn by staying close to older bodies, seeing where they went, what they picked up, what they avoided, and how they handled the world. In this way, culture may begin long before it looks like culture to us. It may begin as repeated behavior that helps a group endure. Still, we must stay careful. We cannot fill their minds with words we do not know they had. We cannot assume they explained the land to one another as we would, but we can recognize that their survival was not blind. They observed, they adjusted. They learned from what the land allowed and what it refused. In a small population, such learning can become precious. If a knowledgeable adult dies, the loss is not only one body, it may also be the loss of roots, timing, stone sources, animal behavior, and remembered dangers. If a child survives long enough to learn these patterns, the group carries more than genes into the future. It carries habits that make genes more likely to continue. This is where memory and inheritance meet. The possible 1,280 were not just biological carriers, they were living beings inside a practical world, where knowing where to walk and what to touch could matter as much as physical strength. The land itself became a kind of unwritten record. Tracks in soft ground, broken branches, distant calls, the smell of water, the shape of clouds, the return of insects, the movement of herds, the feel of stone under the hand, all of these could guide a life. None of them needed to become a story in order to be useful. They only needed to be noticed. If the ancestral road narrowed, then the ones who continued may have done so partly because they could read enough of the world to remain alive within it, not perfectly. Not always. Many lines may still have ended, but enough knowledge, carried quietly through bodies and repeated days, may have helped keep one fragile thread from disappearing. In that sense, a stone flake, a remembered path, and a watched horizon all belong beside the number 1280. They are small things. But in deep history, small things can hold open the future. A small ancestral world was not small only because fewer individuals may have carried the line forward. It was small because the margin around life was narrow. In a large and connected population, mistakes can be absorbed more easily. One group may fail while another continues. One season may be poor in one valley while another region remains generous. A lost route, a bad choice, a dangerous crossing, or the death of one skilled adult may hurt, but the wider population still has room to recover. In a world where the effective breeding population may have fallen to about 1280, recovery itself becomes more fragile. There are fewer chances for the future to correct what the present loses. A child who does not survive is not only a private sorrow, it may also mean one fewer thread in a lineage already thin. An adult who dies before reproducing is not only one life removed from the group, it is one possible branch that will never unfold. A small group that becomes isolated is not only lonely in the landscape, it may become weaker in the deeper mathematics of ancestry. This is why the possible bottleneck should not be imagined only as a number. It should be imagined as a reduction in options. Fewer people means fewer partners, fewer carriers of knowledge, fewer hands to gather, fewer eyes to watch, fewer bodies to protect the young, fewer chances to reconnect after separation, and fewer ways for genetic variation to remain alive. The land around them may still have been wide, but the practical world available to each group could feel very limited. A river too far away is almost the same as no river. Food that appears after a dangerous journey is not the same as food nearby. A neighboring group that exists beyond a dry plain, a predator-rich corridor, or a cold exposed distance may not be reachable when it matters. In such a world, safety is not a permanent place. It is something temporary, made again each day by movement, memory, attention, and the luck of conditions. We should be careful here not to invent a detailed drama that the evidence cannot support. We do not know the exact faces of the individuals behind the 1280 estimate. We do not know the names of their landscapes, the precise shape of their groups, or the private losses they endured. But we can say that small populations are vulnerable in ways large populations are not. A large population can carry many differences within it. A small one can lose differences quickly. A large population can remain connected across many groups. A small, scattered one can become divided into fragile pockets. A large population can endure many deaths before its future is threatened. A small one may feel each loss more heavily. This is the quiet meaning of having fewer choices. It is not only about hunger, it is about having less room to be wrong. If a group followed animals into a difficult region and failed to find enough food, there may have been no easy return. If they stayed near a water source that dried sooner than expected, the young and weak would suffer first. If they avoided contact with strangers for too long, the group might become more isolated. If they moved toward others, they might enter danger or competition. Every path could carry a cost. The ancestors connected to this possible narrowing were not choosing from a full world of options. They were choosing from what the land, the season, and their own bodies allowed. That makes their survival feel less like conquest and more like endurance. They did not need to dominate the earth. They only needed to remain alive enough, connected enough, and fertile enough for the line not to close. The title, When Our Ancestors May Have Shrunk to 1280, points exactly to this fragile place in the story. Shrinking is not only a fall in number, it is a fall in protection, variety, and possibility. It is the moment when the future has fewer doors. And yet, somewhere inside that narrow world, enough doors did not close, enough children lived, enough adults found one another, enough memory remained useful, enough bodies carried the thread forward. The small ancestral world did not have to be heroic to matter. Its importance lies in how little room it may have had, and how much depended on that little room not disappearing completely. The cost of a bottleneck is not only that fewer bodies remain. The deeper cost is that fewer versions of the future remain. Every population carries variation. Some of it is visible in bodies, strength, size, resistance, timing, and development. Much of it is hidden, written quietly in genes that may not show themselves clearly in every generation. In a large population, this variation has more room to continue. Many different family lines can carry many different possibilities. Some may matter in one environment, some in another. Some may never become important unless the world changes. But when a population becomes very small, much of that variation can be lost simply because the individuals carrying it do not leave descendants. This loss does not need to happen with noise. It does not need to look like a dramatic extinction. It can happen softly, through ordinary deaths, fewer births, isolated groups, and branches of ancestry that end without anyone noticing. If the ancestral line leading toward us truly passed through a period of about 1,280 effective breeding individuals, then the future may have passed through a very narrow filter. Not everything that existed before the bottleneck could pass through. Some genetic differences would have continued. Others would have disappeared from the road forever. This is one of the cold truths of deep ancestry. Survival preserves only part of what once lived. It does not keep every possibility safe. A gene variant can vanish not because it was harmful, not because it failed in some obvious way, but because the person or group carrying it did not become part of the continuing line. In a small population, chance becomes stronger. A child's survival, a mother's health, a group's separation, a season of hunger, or a local accident can shape inheritance in ways that have nothing to do with destiny. The smaller the breeding population becomes, the more powerful this kind of randomness can be. Scientists call one part of this process genetic drift, but the idea can be understood without technical language. When only a few lines continue, the future receives only what those few lines carry. Everything outside them may fade, even if it once belonged to living, breathing beings. This is why the number 1,280 should feel heavy, but not sensational. It does not tell us that every ancient human relative vanished. It tells us that the continuing ancestral stream may have become small enough for chance and loss to matter greatly. Imagine a group carrying a basket of seeds across a difficult landscape. If the basket is large and full, many kinds of seeds may survive the journey. If the basket becomes small, if many seeds are lost along the way, the land on the other side may still grow, but it will not grow from everything that once existed. The later forest may be real, wide, and full of life, but it will be shaped by what survived the crossing. In the same way, modern humanity may be large now, but if our deeper ancestral line passed through a severe bottleneck, then part of our genetic history may be the history of what did not make it through. This does not mean we are weak in a simple sense. It means our abundance stands on a selective and fragile past. The people, or early human relatives, behind that past would not have known they were carrying genetic diversity. They would not have understood that the birth of one child and the death of another could alter the shape of distant humanity. They would only have known the closeness of hunger, injury, weather, companionship, and the young who needed to be kept alive. Yet beneath that ordinary life, inheritance was being narrowed. Every generation passed forward some parts of the past and lost others. A bottleneck is therefore not only a fall in population size, it is a quiet editing of possibility. It removes branches before anyone can remember them. It makes the future depend on fewer bodies, fewer pairings, fewer surviving children, and fewer hidden variations. When our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, the world did not need to end for something enormous to be lost. The loss could have happened inside the simple fact that only a thin portion of life continued. Genetic loss is not easy to imagine because it does not make a sound. When a group loses a tool, the tool can be seen lying broken on the ground. When a shelter fails, the body feels the cold. When an animal disappears from a valley, hunger may follow quickly. But when genetic variation is lost, no one living through the moment can see the loss as a loss. A child is born or is not born. A young adult survives or does not survive. A small group finds others or remains alone. A family line continues for a few generations, then ends quietly. Nothing in the sky changes color. No warning appears on the land. Yet, across many generations, these small endings can reshape the future. This is why the cost of a bottleneck can be deeper than the people living through it could ever know. If the ancestral line that led toward us may have narrowed to about 1,280 effective breeding individuals, then the loss was not only a moment of danger, it may have been a long period in which the future kept becoming smaller, one generation at a time. In a battle, loss is visible. Bodies fall. A place changes hands. Survivors remember. But a genetic bottleneck is often quieter than memory. It can happen through fewer births, fewer surviving children, fewer unrelated partners, and fewer branches of ancestry remaining connected. A population may still move, eat, sleep, care for young, and make tools, while hidden variation is slowly disappearing from the line. The people, or early human relatives involved, would not have felt that their descendants were becoming less genetically diverse. They may have felt only ordinary hardship, a difficult season, a dangerous journey, a weakened child, a missing companion, a group that no longer appeared at a familiar meeting place. But over time, ordinary hardship can become inherited narrowing. This is what makes the story of 1,280 so quiet and so serious. The danger may not have been one terrible day. It may have been many ordinary days with fewer successful continuations. Each generation receives only what the previous generation can pass on. If a rare variant is carried by a person whose line ends, that variant is gone from the continuing road. If a small group becomes isolated and later disappears, everything unique to that group may disappear with it. If only a few lines produce most of the descendants, the future becomes shaped around those few lines. None of this means those who vanished were less alive, less capable, or less meaningful. It only means that inheritance is narrow in a way life itself is not. Life is full while it is lived. Ancestry is what remains after time has finished selecting from it. For a small population, this selection can be harsh even without intention. Chance becomes stronger. A storm, a dry season, an injury, a failed birth, or a lost path can remove more than one life. It can remove a possibility that might have moved forward for thousands of generations. And once lost, that possibility cannot simply be recovered by later population growth. Modern humanity may become large, spread across continents, build cities, and fill the world with voices, but expansion after a bottleneck does not bring back every genetic branch that disappeared before the expansion. The tree may grow tall again, but some older branches are already gone. This is why the possible shrinking to 1,280 is not only a story of survival, it is also a story of absence. We carry what came through, but we do not carry everything that once may have existed. Somewhere in that ancient narrowing, many small biological possibilities may have fallen silent. No one mourned them as genes. No one named them as lost futures. They disappeared inside births that did not happen, children who did not live, groups that did not reconnect, and lines that slowly ended. The lesson is not that our ancestors were doomed or weak. It is that continuation can be thin for a very long time. A lineage can keep moving while losing parts of itself. It can survive and still be changed by what survival required. When we listen to the number 1,280, we are not only hearing how few may have carried the ancestral road forward, we are hearing the long quiet after everything that did not pass through. The phrase shrunk to 1,280 can sound like a simple fall, as if a crowd became smaller until only a few remained. But in the deeper language of ancestry, Shrinking means something more than bodies disappearing from a landscape. It means the road of descent becoming narrow. It means fewer lines passing forward. It means fewer hidden variations surviving the crossing from one age into the next. The number is powerful because it gives shape to something that would otherwise be almost impossible to feel. Without it, we might speak only in vague terms: pressure, hardship, population decline, loss of diversity. But 1,280 turns the idea into a small doorway. It asks us to imagine the human future not as a wide road, but as a thin passage carried by a limited number of successful lives. Still, we must keep the number in its proper place. It is not a final photograph of ancient Earth. It is not proof that exactly 1,280 human relatives stood together in one valley. It is an estimate from a model, a possible signal in the genetic history of the line that eventually led toward modern humans. Its meaning depends on caution, yet caution does not remove the emotional weight. It makes the weight more honest. If the effective breeding population truly became that small, then the ancestral line was not merely reduced, it was filtered. The future was forced through fewer bodies, fewer pairings, fewer children who lived long enough to have children of their own. This is why the title should not be heard as a dramatic claim that humanity almost ended in a single scene. It should be heard as a slow image of narrowing. A lineage can shrink across time the way a river shrinks across dry land. At first, it is broad enough to divide into channels. Then, the channels become shallow, some vanish beneath sand, some turn away and never reach the sea. The water that continues is still water, but it no longer carries everything it once held. In the same way, the ancestral stream that reached us may have lost many branches before it widened again. Modern humanity, with all its voices and faces, may stand downstream from that earlier narrowing. But expansion later does not erase the fact that the passage may once have been thin. This is what makes the 1,280 more than a statistic. It becomes a symbol of a fragile inheritance. Every person alive today belongs to a world that feels large, but the path behind that largeness may have passed through a time when continuity was not guaranteed. The early human relatives in that period did not know they were part of such a symbol. They did not think in terms of future humanity, genetic diversity, or ancestral bottlenecks. They lived near water when they could. They followed signs in the land. They used stone, movement, attention, and group life to continue through ordinary days. Their struggles were local, immediate, and physical. But from far away in time, those ordinary struggles become connected to a larger question. How narrow can a living line become and still remain unbroken? The possible answer, suggested by the 1,280, is both humbling and unsettling. It says that the human story may not have begun as something broad and secure. It may have passed through a stage where chance mattered greatly, where each surviving child mattered more, where isolation could be dangerous, and where every lost branch made the future less varied than it might have been. To shrink, then, is not only to become fewer, it is to carry less of the past forward. It is to leave behind unseen possibilities. It is to arrive at the future with a smaller inheritance than once existed. And yet, the line did arrive. That is the quiet tension at the center of this part of the story. The bottleneck, if it happened as the model suggests, was both a loss and a passage. It removed, but it did not end. It narrowed, but it did not close. Somewhere inside a changing world, through bodies that never knew their importance, the ancestral thread became thin enough to frighten the imagination, yet strong enough not to break. Modern DNA can open a door into deep time, but it cannot turn the past into a clear, moving picture. This is one of the most important truths in the story of the 1,280. When scientists study genomes today, they are not watching ancient people walk across a landscape. They are studying patterns that remain after countless generations of birth, death, separation, mixing, and loss. DNA can suggest that a population once became smaller. It can show signs that diversity narrowed. It can help researchers build models of what kind of ancestral history may have produced the genetic variation we see now. But DNA does not give us the sound of an ancient voice. It does not show the face of one mother carrying a child through dry ground. It does not tell us which river failed, which group moved away, which child survived, or which path became too dangerous to follow. It speaks in traces, not in scenes. This is why the possible shrinking to about 1,280 effective breeding individuals must be handled with care. The number is not meaningless. It comes from a serious attempt to read the shape of ancestry through genetic evidence, but it is also not a time machine. It does not allow us to step back nearly 1 million years and count every living human relative. It does not allow us to say exactly where the bottleneck happened, what the people looked like in each group, or what single pressure caused the narrowing. A model can be powerful and limited at the same time. In fact, that is often how science works. It gives us ways to approach what cannot be touched directly, while also asking us to remember the distance between evidence and imagination. For a video about human origins, this distinction is not a small detail. It is the center of honesty. If we turn the 1,280 into a perfect fact, we make the story sharper but less truthful. If we dismiss it completely because it is uncertain, we lose the quiet wonder of what genetic research may be revealing. The better path is slower. We can say that one study suggests a severe bottleneck in the ancestral line leading toward modern humans. We can say that this bottleneck may have reduced the effective breeding population to roughly 1,280 individuals. We can say that this idea is still open to testing, discussion, and refinement, and we can allow the listener to feel the weight of that possibility without pretending that every detail has been solved. This kind of careful language may seem less dramatic, but it is more valuable. It teaches us how to listen to evidence without forcing it to say more than it can. Deep history is made from different kinds of clues. Fossils give us bodies, but only when bodies are preserved. Stone tools give us actions, but rarely the people behind them. Climate records give us pressure, but not always the exact human response. DNA gives us patterns of inheritance, but not the complete lived world. Each kind of evidence is like a lamp placed in a dark room. One lamp may show the wall, another may show the floor, another may reveal a doorway, but none of them lights the entire house. The possible bottleneck belongs inside that dimly lit house. It is visible enough to matter, but not bright enough to answer every question. The ancestors behind it remain partly hidden. We can approach them through probability, comparison, and careful reasoning, but we cannot turn them into characters with invented certainty. This does not make the story weaker. It makes it quieter and perhaps more human. Our origin is not a clean legend passed down intact. It is a difficult reconstruction from remains, absences, and signals that survived by chance. The number 1,280 may be one of those signals. It may point to a time when the line leading to us became extremely narrow, but the signal must not be mistaken for the whole world. It is a sign in the dark, not the darkness itself. And if we are honest, that may be the most powerful part of the story. Our beginning can be studied, but not fully possessed. The study of deep human origin is not like reading one book from beginning to end. It is more like listening to several quiet voices speaking from different rooms, each one telling part of the truth, each one leaving something out. Fossils speak through bodies, but only the bodies that survive decay, erosion, animals, water, and time. Archaeology speaks through stone tools, cut marks, fire traces, and places where activity may have happened, but tools do not always reveal who made them, how many people were present, or whether their descendants continued. Climate records speak through ice, sediment, pollen, dust, ocean chemistry, and old landscapes, but climate pressure does not automatically tell us what every group did in response. Genetics speaks through living inheritance, through patterns in DNA that may point back toward older population changes, but DNA cannot show the full daily world in which those changes occurred. When we place these forms of evidence beside the possible bottleneck of 1,280, They do not always join into one simple picture. This is not a failure of science. It is the nature of deep time. One kind of evidence may be strong in one place and almost absent in another. A fossil may suggest that early humans or their relatives lived in a region, while genetic models suggest that only a narrow ancestral line continued into later populations. Stone tools may show presence, but not population size. A climate shift may suggest hardship, but not prove that it alone caused a reduction in breeding individuals. A genetic signal may point toward a severe narrowing, but the fossil record may not provide enough bones from the exact period to let us see the people behind that signal clearly. The result is a story built from overlap, tension, and careful restraint. A less careful story would force all the evidence to agree too quickly. It would say that a particular climate event caused a specific population collapse, that a few surviving ancestors lived in one known place, and that the number 1280 explains everything. That would make the story easier to tell, but not necessarily more truthful. A careful story accepts that different evidence works at different scales. Genetics can reach across many generations and infer broad patterns of ancestry. Fossils can reveal anatomy, but only when the right remains are found. Archaeology can show behavior, but often without a clear link to one exact lineage. Climate data can describe environmental pressure, but not the private decisions of small groups moving through that pressure. Each clue is valuable, but each clue has edges. The ancestors connected to this possible narrowing lived inside those edges. They were not waiting for future scientists to understand them. They were living in places that may now be dry, buried, eroded, drowned, or changed beyond recognition. Their bones may not have fossilized. Their resting places may have left no clear mark. Their tools, if they made or used them, may have been scattered, reused, or separated from the bodies that held them. Their genetic contribution may remain in us, but only as a pattern, not as a full memory. This is why Truk 7 belongs in the center of the video. It protects the whole story from becoming too confident. The title, When Our Ancestors May Have Shrunk to 1280, is powerful because it opens a door. But after opening the door, we must not pretend that the room is fully lit. We can say that a genetic study suggests a severe bottleneck. We can say that environmental instability may have formed part of the background. We can say that the fossil and archaeological records remain incomplete. We can say that the human family at that time was complex, with multiple related populations and uncertain relationships. What we should not do is turn every possibility into a fact. In a truthful sleep story, uncertainty does not weaken the listener's experience. It deepens it. It allows the past to remain vast, quiet, and partly hidden. It reminds us that our origin is not a finished answer placed neatly in our hands. It is a careful conversation between bones, stones, climate, genes, and silence. A truthful story does not become weaker when it admits what it does not know. In deep human history, honesty is not a pause in the story, it is part of the story itself. The possible bottleneck of 1,280 effective breeding individuals is powerful because it gives us a number small enough to feel almost impossible. But if we hold the number too tightly, we may turn a scientific possibility into a legend. If we hold it too loosely, we may lose the meaning of what the evidence is trying to suggest. The careful path lies between those two mistakes. We can let the number matter without making it carry more certainty than it can bear. We can say that one genetic study suggests a severe narrowing in the ancestral line leading toward modern humans. We can say that this narrowing may have occurred long before Homo sapiens appeared. We can say that climate instability, environmental pressure, group separation, and chance may all have belonged to the world around that narrowing. But we should also say that we do not know the exact faces of those ancestors, the exact landscape they occupied, the exact reason their line became so small, or whether future research will change the shape of this idea. This kind of restraint is not a failure of imagination, it is respect for the past. The people, or early human relatives, behind the possible 1,280 were not symbols to themselves. They were living beings inside ordinary pressure. They did not know they were part of a model. They did not know their descendants might one day search for traces of them in DNA. They did not know that a video, a paper, a museum, or a scientist would ever speak about their survival. Their lives were immediate, physical, and local. Because of that, we should not cover them with invented detail just to make the story feel complete. We do not need to say what they believed if we do not know. We do not need to give them modern language if the evidence cannot support it. We do not need to place them around secure fires, in organized camps, or inside dramatic scenes of final survival unless the evidence allows it. Their real importance is already enough. They may have carried the line forward through a time when carrying it forward was not guaranteed. That is more powerful than any decoration. A truthful video about human origins should leave the listener with a sense of wonder, but also with a sense of how science works. Science does not always speak in final answers. Often, it speaks in careful probabilities. It builds models, tests them, compares them, questions them, and changes them when better evidence appears. This is especially true when the subject lies hundreds of thousands of years beyond direct memory. The past we are discussing is older than writing, older than cities, older than agriculture, older than our species. It is a past made from fragments. A tooth may survive while a whole group disappears. A stone tool may remain while the hand that used it is gone. A climate signal may show pressure while the human response remains hidden. A genome may suggest narrowing while the lived experience of that narrowing stays silent. To tell such a story truthfully, we must not pretend that fragments are the same as certainty, but we must also not ignore them because they are incomplete. The value lies in listening carefully to what each fragment can say. This is why stopping at the right place matters. There is a moment in every origin story when the storyteller must choose between saying more and saying only what can be responsibly said. With the 1280, that moment comes again and again. We can approach the number. We can explain it. We can imagine the kind of world in which such narrowing might happen, but we cannot turn it into a complete memory. And perhaps that is fitting. Our beginning was not preserved as a finished message waiting for us. It was carried forward through bodies, losses, chances, and silences. To respect that beginning, we do not need to close every question. Sometimes the most honest thing we can do is leave a little darkness around the light. A small lineage can survive not because it is safe, but because it keeps finding ways not to stop. This is the gentler side of the 1280. Until now, the number has shown us narrowing, loss, uncertainty, and the quiet danger of a bottleneck. But if the ancestral line truly became so small, then another truth must also be held beside the danger. It did not break. Something continued. Not because the world protected it, and not because the future was guaranteed, but because enough living beings kept meeting the demands of their time. For early human relatives, survival would have depended on movement, attention, and adjustment. A group that could no longer rely on one place might need to search beyond it. A dry water source might push them toward another valley. A change in animal movement might require a change in route. A season with fewer plants might make scavenging, tool use, or wider foraging more important. Adaptation did not need to look dramatic. It could be as quiet as leaving a familiar place before hunger became too severe, remembering a distant source of stone, following signs of water after rain, or staying near others because isolation was dangerous. In a small ancestral world, these ordinary choices could matter deeply. They were not acts of conquest, they were acts of continuation. The ancestors connected to the possible bottleneck did not need to master the earth. They needed to remain flexible enough to live within it. A rigid group, tied too strongly to one route, one resource, or one pattern, might suffer when the environment changed. A more flexible group might have a better chance of enduring the same pressure. This does not mean they planned in the modern sense. It means that bodies, memory, learned behavior, and group experience could help them respond when familiar conditions shifted. Early humans were not passive objects moved by climate. They were living organisms with attention, memory, hands, tools, and social dependence. They could notice. They could repeat what worked. They could avoid what had harmed them before. They could learn from the presence of older individuals and from the behavior of animals, weather, and land. This kind of learning may seem simple beside modern intelligence, but in deep time, simple learning repeated across generations can become powerful. It can keep a group alive long enough for children to grow. It can help scattered groups reconnect. It can allow a lineage to pass through a difficult age without disappearing completely. When we return to the title, when our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, the word shrunk should not only make us think of weakness, it should also make us think of endurance under pressure. A small line has less room to lose, but it can still move. It can bend. It can change direction. It can pass through a narrow place if enough conditions align. There may have been many failures around it, many branches that did not continue, many groups whose stories ended. Yet the line leading toward us remained open. That survival may have depended on no single heroic invention. It may have depended on many quiet capacities working together, walking long distances, using stone edges, remembering landscapes, caring for young, staying close enough to others, and sensing when a place no longer offered what it once did. We should not make this too romantic. Survival in such a world would have been hard, and many lives may have ended early. But neither should we imagine these ancestors as helpless. Their continuation tells us that they were capable enough for their circumstances, at least often enough for the thread to remain unbroken. The possible bottleneck is frightening because the line became thin. It is also humbling because thin does not always mean finished. Sometimes a lineage survives not by becoming powerful, but by remaining responsive. It listens to the land, without words. It follows water without maps. It carries knowledge without writing. It moves through uncertainty, not knowing that one day, far in the future, its narrow passage would become our question. In a small ancestral world, survival may have depended not only on the strength of one body, but on the nearness of other bodies. This does not mean we should imagine modern kindness, modern families, or modern moral ideas placed too far back in time. We should be careful. The early human relatives connected to the possible bottleneck were not modern people with written values or spoken explanations like ours, but social life itself is older than civilization. Staying near others can protect the young. Shared attention can reveal danger sooner. A group can watch more of the landscape than one individual alone. A wounded member may survive longer if the group does not immediately abandon them. A child, helpless for a long time compared with many other animals, has a better chance when care is not carried by one body alone. In this quiet sense, cooperation may have been one of the small forces that helped keep the ancestral line from breaking. The number 1,280 points to fragility. But fragility does not always mean isolation. Sometimes, fragility makes connection more important. If food was uncertain, a group that could tolerate sharing may have had a better chance than one in which every shortage broke the bond between members. If a hunter, scavenger, or forager found something useful, the way that food moved through the group could shape who lived long enough to reproduce. If adults stayed close to infants, if older individuals knew places younger ones had not yet learned, if group members responded to danger together, then survival was not only individual, it became distributed across relationships. We should not turn this into a perfect picture. Early human groups may also have faced tension, competition, fear, and separation. A small group under pressure is not automatically peaceful. Hunger can strain bonds. Distance can break contact. Injury can become a burden. Strangers may not always be welcomed, but even with these limits, some level of social dependence was likely central to the human line. Our ancestors did not become human by living as isolated bodies scattered across the land. They belonged to groups, and in groups, survival could be shared unevenly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. The care of young is especially important when thinking about a bottleneck. A lineage does not continue through adults alone. It continues through children who survive long enough to become parents themselves. In difficult environments, Childhood is a long and vulnerable bridge. It requires food, carrying, protection, warmth, and time. If too many children die before they can reproduce, the future narrows quickly. If enough children survive, even a small lineage can continue. A mother alone may struggle to provide everything in a harsh landscape, but if others help, even in simple ways, the child's chance may improve. Help might mean protection nearby, access to shared food, tolerance from the group, or the presence of older individuals who remember where resources can be found. We do not need to imagine formal roles or modern family structures to recognize the value of this. We only need to see that a young life is easier to keep alive when it is held within a group rather than left entirely to chance. Sharing food may also have mattered because food in ancient landscapes was often uneven. Some days may have offered more than one body could use immediately. Other days may have offered very little. In a world of uncertainty, sharing can smooth the hard edges of luck. One individual may fail to find enough, while another succeeds. One group member may be injured, pregnant, young, old, or weak. If food sometimes moved from those who had it to those who needed it, the group could preserve bodies that might later matter to survival, knowledge, reproduction, or care. This is not sentimentality. It is biology lived socially. A small population cannot afford too much loss. Each living connection may carry value beyond the moment. When our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, the continuation of the line may have depended on these quiet forms of social life. Not perfect harmony, not heroic sacrifice, but enough tolerance, enough attention, enough shared survival to keep young bodies alive and adult bodies connected. The ancestral thread may have been thin, but it was not carried by isolated strands alone. It may have been braided, however roughly, through group life. Survival does not always look like victory. In deep time, it may look much smaller than that. It may look like a child living through one more cold season. It may look like a weakened adult reaching water before the group must move again. It may look like a few scattered groups remaining close enough, across distance and uncertainty, for the ancestral line not to close. When we think about the possible bottleneck of 1,280 effective breeding individuals, the mind naturally searches for a great turning point, some clear moment when our ancestors overcame danger and secured the future. But the ancient world may not have offered such a moment. There may have been no single rescue, no sudden breakthrough, no day when the line became safe. The continuation of our ancestry may have depended instead on ordinary survival repeated across many generations. Enough food found, enough injuries endured, enough infants kept alive, enough adults reaching one another, enough movement before a place became too dry, too cold, too empty, or too dangerous. This is a quieter kind of endurance, and perhaps a truer one. A small lineage does not need to become powerful in order to continue. It only needs to remain possible. In a world of changing climates and scattered groups, possibility itself may have been fragile. Each generation would have inherited not a promise, but a situation. Some water remained, some food could be found, some companions were still near, some memory still worked, some children still grew. That may sound simple, but in a bottleneck, simple things become enormous. A birth matters. A meeting between groups matters. A remembered route matters. A shared piece of food matters. A safe night matters. None of these things would be recorded. None would be recognized as a turning point. Yet together, they could hold open the future. This is why the story of 1,280 should not be told only as a story of almost disappearing. It is also a story of barely continuing. Those two ideas are not the same. Almost disappearing looks toward the edge. Barely continuing looks toward the thread that did not break. The ancestors who carried that thread were not heroes in the modern sense. They did not know there was a human story to save. They did not know that their descendants might one day study genes, measure time, or look back with wonder at how narrow the road may have become. They simply lived. They responded to hunger, weather, distance, pain, and the needs of those nearby. They may have followed animals, searched for plants, used stone edges, watched the sky, learned the land, and stayed close enough to others to keep the group from becoming only separate bodies in a harsh world. Their success, if we can call it that, was not domination, it was persistence, and persistence is often less visible than strength. A powerful group may leave monuments. A persistent group may leave only descendants. In the deepest origin of humanity, descendants are sometimes the only monument that remains. This gives the number 1280 a different feeling. It is not only a warning about how close the ancestral line may have come to narrowing beyond repair. It is also a reminder that life can continue without knowing it is important. The line did not need to understand itself in order to remain alive. It did not need names, histories, or explanations. It needed enough living connections across enough time. That is all, and that is immense. When we look at modern humanity, with billions of people spread across the planet, it is easy to forget that abundance can come after narrowness. A vast forest can grow from seeds that nearly did not survive the crossing. A river can widen after passing through stone. A lineage can become enormous after once, depending on very few. If our ancestors truly passed through such a bottleneck, then the lesson is not that survival was guaranteed by greatness. It is that the future may sometimes rest on something much quieter. Just enough life remaining for tomorrow to begin. After a narrow passage, a lineage does not immediately become a world. This is important to remember as we move beyond the possible bottleneck of 1280. If the ancestral line leading toward us truly passed through such a severe reduction, that did not mean modern humanity appeared on the other side like a finished answer. There was no sudden arrival of Homo sapiens. There was no instant leap into language, art, memory, or the kind of mind that now looks backward and asks where it came from. The road after the bottleneck was still long, uncertain, and filled with branches. Early human relatives continued to live across changing landscapes. Some groups may have expanded, some may have separated, some may have met and mixed. Others may have faded from the record, leaving behind only tools, bones, or nothing at all. The human family was not a single clean line walking forward. It was a slow, uneven web of related populations, shaped by distance, climate, migration, isolation, and contact. The possible 1280 belongs to one part of that web, the ancestral stream that may have continued toward later humans. But around that stream, deep time held many other movements. Some human relatives may have carried their own histories for thousands of generations. Some may have adapted well to particular environments, then disappeared when those environments changed. Some may have contributed to later ancestry in ways still difficult to reconstruct. Others may have lived real lives without leaving descendants that reach the present. This is why the story after the bottleneck should not be told as a simple rescue. A narrow line continuing does not mean the danger ended. It only means the line remained open. After such a passage, the future would still have depended on births, movement, group connection, and survival across many more ages. If population size later increased, that increase would not restore everything that had been lost. The line could widen, but it would widen from what had passed through the narrow gate. The ancient world kept changing, and early humans kept changing with it. Their tools, bodies, and movements belong to a long process rather than a single transformation. Long after the period suggested by the 1280 estimate, different human forms would continue to appear and disappear. Some would become ancestors of later groups. Some would become close relatives rather than direct ancestors. Some would share space with others. Some would become known to us only because a fragment survived in soil, stone, or DNA. Modern humans would appear much later, after immense stretches of time had already passed. This delay matters because it protects the honesty of the story. We should not imagine the bottleneck as the moment when we, in the modern sense, began. It was not the birth of civilization, and not even the birth of our species. It was, if the model is right, a narrowing in a deeper ancestral line, long before that line became the people who would one day paint, bury, speak, farm, write, and remember. The origin of humanity is therefore not a single point. It is a layered history. One layer may be the bottleneck. Another layer is the expansion that followed. Another is the later branching of ancient human populations. Another is the eventual emergence of Homo sapiens. Another is the long meeting of human groups across landscapes we are still trying to understand. Each layer matters, but none should be forced to carry the whole story alone. The number 1,280 gives us a powerful image of narrowness, yet it does not explain every later human path. It opens a question about fragility, then leads us into a wider and more complicated history. After the narrow gate, the road did not become simple. It became longer, and somewhere along that long road, the descendants of a fragile line continued moving through a world that still did not know what they would become. Homo sapiens did not appear immediately after the possible bottleneck. This is one of the easiest mistakes to make when hearing a number as striking as 1,280. The mind wants a clean shape. The line becomes narrow, the survivors continue, and then modern humans arrive. But deep time does not move that quickly. If the bottleneck suggested by the genetic model occurred roughly between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, then hundreds of thousands of years still had to pass before the earliest known Homo sapiens appeared. Our species emerged much later, probably in Africa, after a long and complicated history of earlier human populations that had already been changing, separating, and reconnecting for immense stretches of time. The beings who carried the ancestral line through the narrow passage were not yet us. They were part of the older human family, close enough to matter deeply, but still far from the modern human world. Their descendants did not wake one day as Homo sapiens. Their bodies, brains, behaviors, and relationships changed slowly across generations that could not see the direction of the change. This matters because the title of the video is about our ancestors, not about modern people suddenly reduced to a tiny group. When our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, the word ancestors reaches into a time before the face of modern humanity had fully formed. It reaches into an older stream, where many related human groups existed in ways that do not fit neatly into our ordinary categories. Some would eventually connect to the line leading toward Homo sapiens. Some may have contributed to other branches. Some may have vanished without leaving a clear genetic path into living people. Later, the human world would include forms such as Neanderthals and Denisovans, close relatives whose stories remind us again that humanity was never a single, simple road. Even after Homo sapiens appeared, our species did not live alone in an empty human world. We eventually shared time, space, and in some cases, ancestry with other human relatives. That later complexity grew from older complexity. It did not begin suddenly. The possible bottleneck, if real in the way the model suggests, was one deep layer beneath all of it. It may have shaped the genetic background from which later populations emerged, but it was not the final chapter of origin. It was not the moment when language, art, symbolic thought, or modern culture arrived. Those belong to later developments, with their own evidence and their own uncertainties. A truthful story must keep the layers separate. The bottleneck belongs to the deep ancestral past. Homo sapiens belongs to a later chapter. Civilization belongs to a chapter later still. If we collapse them into one scene, we make the story simpler, but also less true. Imagine standing on a long road at night, holding a small lamp. Behind you is a narrow passage through stone, so tight that only a thin stream could pass. Ahead of you, the road continues beyond the reach of the light. The passage matters because everything ahead must come through it, but the passage is not the whole journey. After it, there are valleys, crossings, losses, meetings, and changes still unseen. In the same way, the possible 1,280 may represent a narrow ancestral gate, but the emergence of Homo sapiens lay far beyond that gate. Many generations would still be born and disappear, Many groups would still move through Africa and beyond. Many forms of early humanity would still test the limits of climate, food, tools, cooperation, and distance. The modern human story was slowly assembled from these older layers, not delivered all at once. This slower view may feel less dramatic, but it is more moving. It means that our origin was not one miracle after one crisis. It was a long continuation after a narrowing, a widening after a loss, a future unfolding from a line that had once become small. The ancestors behind the 1,280 did not become us directly in a simple step. They became part of the deep ground from which, much later, our species would rise. Modern humanity is not the result of one moment. It is the result of many layers of time resting quietly on top of one another. The possible bottleneck of 1,280 belongs to one deep layer, but it does not contain the whole story. Before it, there were older branches of the human family, older migrations, older adaptations, older losses. After it, there were still hundreds of thousands of years of change before Homo sapiens appeared. Then, even after our species emerged, the story did not become simple. Populations moved, separated, mixed, adapted, and sometimes vanished. Some human relatives lived beside our ancestors for a time. Some left genetic traces, some left tools, bones, or only questions. The human story grew not like a straight road, but like a landscape shaped by many rivers. Some rivers joined. Some dried before reaching the sea. Some flowed underground, unseen for long distances, then appeared again in another form. When we look back and ask whether our ancestors may have shrunk to 1,280, we are looking at one narrow place in that landscape, not the entire map. This matters because origin stories can easily become too simple. We may want to say that first there was danger, then survival, then us. But the truth is slower. The line that led toward us passed through changing bodies, changing environments, and changing relationships long before it became recognizable as modern human life. There was no single dawn when the world suddenly became human. There were countless mornings that no one recorded, countless generations that lived and died without knowing they were part of anything we would later call history. A child born after the bottleneck, if the bottleneck happened, was not born into safety. That child still belonged to an uncertain world. Their group still needed water, food, shelter, movement, and connection. Their descendants still faced climate shifts, local extinctions, isolation, disease, hunger, injury, and the simple randomness that follows all living things. The fact that the line continued does not mean the line was protected. It only means that enough lives continued long enough to become the ground beneath later lives. This is the slower meaning of ancestry. Each generation receives the past, but only in pieces. It receives bodies shaped by earlier survival. It receives habits that may help or fail. It receives landscapes already changed by forces too large for any group to control. It receives genetic variation that has passed through many filters, including possible moments of severe narrowing. Then, it adds its own fragile layer. Some of that layer continues, some does not. Over immense time, these layers become what we call humanity. The 1,280, if the estimate is close to the truth, was not the final explanation of who we are. It was one ancient constraint, one narrow inheritance, one reminder that the later abundance of our species may have grown from a past that had already lost many possibilities. Modern people are not simply the winners of a clean evolutionary contest. We are the descendants of survival, chance, loss, mixing, separation, and return. We carry a history that is both biological and unfinished. We carry what passed through, and we also carry the silence of what did not. This is why the story should not end with the number itself. A number can open the door, but time is the room beyond it. Behind modern humanity are not only the ancestors who continued, but also the vanished branches that make the continuing line meaningful. Behind every living human body is a sequence of survivals so long that the mind cannot hold it all at once. The possible bottleneck gives that sequence a moment of sharp narrowness, but the larger story remains layered, patient, and incomplete. We are not here because one event made us inevitable. We are here because, across many different ages, enough lines did not close. The modern human world is wide, but it was built from older narrowings. It is loud, but it rests on silences. It feels present and solid, but beneath it are nearly forgotten passages where the future was still only a possibility, moving quietly through living bodies. The number 1280 reminds us that existence is not automatic. It is easy, from the safety of the present, to feel as if humanity was always going to arrive. We look at the modern world with its crowded cities, languages, machines, music, memory, and science, and we may imagine that all of this was waiting somewhere inside time. But deep history does not work that way. There was no promise written into the earth that one day a species like ours would appear. There was no protection around the ancestral line because it would later learn to ask questions about itself. The line that led toward us was one living thread among many, and according to one genetic model, that thread may once have narrowed to about 1,280 effective breeding individuals. If that possibility is close to the truth, then the human story passed through a stage where continuation depended on very little. Not little in value, but little in number, little in margin, little in protection from chance. This should make the present feel different. Every person alive today belongs to a vast human world, but the road behind that world may have once been thin enough to be broken by repeated loss, isolation, hunger, disease, climate pressure, or simple accident. A child who survived mattered. A group that stayed connected mattered. A remembered path to water mattered. A birth in a difficult season mattered. These things did not look grand when they happened. They were not recorded. They were not celebrated. But they may have carried the future in ways no one living then could understand. The possible bottleneck teaches a quiet humility. It tells us that being here is not the same as being inevitable. We are used to thinking of humans as powerful because we see what humans later built. But before power, before civilization, before writing, before our species itself, there was vulnerability. There were bodies that could be injured, infants that could fail to survive, groups that could become too small, and landscapes that could change faster than memory could adjust. The ancestors behind this story did not stand above nature. They lived inside it. They were not masters of the earth. They were participants in a difficult living world shaped by water, stone, animals, plants, weather, and distance. If their line continued, it was not because the world owed them survival. It was because, across enough generations, enough life remained connected. This is a valuable lesson for anyone listening now, especially in a world where modern people can forget how dependent life still is on fragile conditions. The story of 1280 does not ask us to feel fear. It asks us to feel proportion. It places humanity back inside the larger history of life, where every species is temporary, every population depends on its environment, and every future grows from conditions that can change. We are not outside that truth. We came from it. The same earth that allowed our ancestors to continue also tested them. The same processes that narrowed their line also shaped the world that later allowed expansion. To understand our origin honestly is to understand that survival was never a possession. It was a relationship with the land, with other bodies, with reproduction, with chance, and with time. This does not make human life smaller in meaning. It makes it more precious. If the road to us once became so narrow, then every life now stands at the end of an immense sequence of continuations that almost cannot be imagined. We carry, in our bodies, the result of those who lived without knowing they were carrying anything for us. We carry the memory of no named hero, no written witness, no clear monument, but a chain of survival older than speech. The number 1280 is therefore not only a scientific possibility, it is a reminder to be careful with certainty, careful with nature, careful with one another, and careful with the idea that the present was guaranteed. Our existence may be wide now, but its roots may have once passed through a place almost too narrow to see. To understand the possible bottleneck of 1,280 is not only to look backward, it is also to learn how to stand more carefully in the present. A story like this can easily become a strange fact, something repeated because the number is surprising. But if we listen more slowly, the number teaches something larger than surprise. It teaches humility. Modern humans often live as if the world is something separate from us, something outside the human story. We build walls, roads, screens, and cities, and these things can make us feel protected from the older conditions of life. But our beginning reminds us that humanity was never separate from the earth. Our ancestors survived only because bodies, landscapes, climates, water, food, birth, and group life remained connected in ways that allowed the line to continue. If any part of that connection had failed too deeply, the story may have been different. This does not mean the past should be used to frighten us. Fear is too simple. The better lesson is respect. Respect for the living conditions that make any population possible. Respect for the fragile networks that hold life together. Respect for the fact that intelligence did not lift our ancestors outside nature before they had to survive within it. Even now, with all our knowledge, we still depend on air, water, food, climate, other species, and one another. The possible narrowing to 1,280 reminds us that life is not made secure by confidence alone. It is made secure by balance, connection, and the ability to respond wisely when conditions change. There is also a lesson about science itself. A truthful origin story does not need to pretend that every question has been solved. The number 1,280 is powerful, but it should be spoken with care. It comes from a genetic model, not from direct observation. It points toward a possible severe bottleneck, but it does not give us every face, every place, or every cause. To say this clearly is not to weaken the story, it strengthens it. In a world where information can become exaggerated very quickly, careful language is a form of respect. It respects the listener. It respects the evidence. It respects the people of the deep past, whose lives should not be turned into fiction simply because we want the story to feel complete. When we say may have, we are not making the story less interesting. We are making it more honest. And honesty is one of the quiet values this video can offer. The past deserves wonder, but it also deserves patience. It asks us to live with uncertainty without filling every silence with invention. It asks us to understand that knowledge grows slowly, through studies, questions, disagreement, correction, and better evidence over time. That is not a weakness of science. That is its strength. The story of our ancestors may also soften the way we think about ourselves. If the line that led to us once became so narrow, then no human life today is ordinary in the shallow sense. Every person carries the result of an unbroken chain reaching back through countless fragile generations. We do not carry that chain because we are better than the vanished branches. We carry it because some lines continued and others did not. This should make us less arrogant, not more. It should remind us that survival is not always proof of superiority. Sometimes, survival is the result of timing, environment, connection, adaptation, and chance. Many forms of life have vanished. Many human relatives have vanished. Many possible futures disappeared before anyone could name them. We are here, but being here does not make us the center of all meaning. It gives us responsibility. Responsibility to treat evidence carefully. Responsibility to treat the living world carefully. Responsibility to remember that the future, like the past, is shaped by choices, conditions, and relationships. If 1,280 is even close to the truth, then our origin carries a quiet message. Life can become very small and still continue, but it should never be taken for granted. And now, near the end of this long, quiet road, the number 1,280 should no longer feel like only a number. It should feel like a small opening in the dark. Through it, we have tried to look back toward a time before our species, before written memory, before villages, before names, before anyone could ask what it meant to be human. We have not found a complete picture there. We have found something more fragile, a possibility suggested by genetic evidence, a possible narrowing in the ancestral line, a reminder that the road to us may once have become very thin. That thinness does not give us every answer. It does not tell us exactly where those ancestors lived, what they saw each morning, how they sounded to one another, or which pressures weighed most heavily on their groups. But it does ask us to listen differently. It asks us to hear silence as part of the story. So much of the past did not survive in bone, stone, or DNA. So many lives passed through the world and left no mark that we can recognize. A child who lived one more season, an adult who remembered a path to water, a small group that found others after distance had separated them, a body that carried a hidden variation forward, a branch that ended without anyone knowing it had ended. These things may have shaped the human future more deeply than monuments, because they came before monuments were possible. The ancestors behind this possible bottleneck did not know they were ancient. They did not know they were close to the beginning of anything we would later call our story. They did not know that future beings would study genomes, compare fossils, measure old climates, and wonder whether the line had once nearly closed. They lived in the only world available to them, the present of hunger, weather, movement, pain, attention, companionship, birth, and loss. And yet, through that present, something continued. Not everything, not every branch, not every possibility, but enough. Enough for the line to widen later, enough for later human forms to appear, enough for Homo sapiens to emerge far beyond that ancient narrowing. Enough for memory, language, science, and reflection to become possible one day. This is the gentle lesson of the 1280. We should not use the past to make ourselves feel chosen. We should use it to remember how dependent we are on continuity, on evidence, on the living world, and on one another. Our existence is not a trophy taken from time. It is an inheritance carried through time, shaped by survival and loss together. The human story is not pure triumph. It is also absence. It is the sound of vanished branches around the one that remained. It is the weight of unknown ancestors whose lives cannot be recovered, but whose continuation may still live quietly inside us. When we breathe, think, remember, and ask where we came from, we do so at the far end of a chain that was never guaranteed. That does not make life frightening. It makes it tender. It reminds us to be careful with certainty, careful with nature, careful with the stories we tell, and careful with the future we are now shaping for others. If the ancestral road once narrowed to something as small as 1,280 effective breeding individuals, then the greatest wonder may not be that humanity became large. The greater wonder may be that the line did not disappear before it ever learned to know itself. And if a single fragile thread of life could carry all of us into the present, how many other silent threads in the deep past were lost before anyone was here to listen?